have been strong criticisms of legislation in Hungary and Poland, which were seen as undermining the independence of the judiciary. There were also action against independent media, against NGOs, and altogether the impression was created and grew stronger and stronger that these issues had to be addressed. The first action was taken by the Commission against Poland, and now, just a short time ago, the European Parliament initiated the Article 7 procedure against Hungary. Article 7 is an instrument to ensure respect for Article 2, and Article 2 refers to the values of the European Union: democracy, rule of law, and human rights, basically. Article 7 is a complicated instrument. The thresholds are very high. There are basically 3 stages. The first stage is when the Council decides with a 4/5 majority, with also the agreement of the European Parliament, that there is a threat against the values of Article 2. The threshold is already very difficult and hard to reach. The second step, more difficult even, requires unanimity in the Council that such a breach has actually occurred. And the third stage is then a decision on the sanctions, which can go up to suspending the voting rights of the country. So, but basically, when you initiate such a procedure, you really don't want to do any of these things. The whole thing is to exert pressure on the government, basically change its approach and reverse the kind of negative steps that have been taken, change its legislation, and make sure that the threat to these values is removed. It has been called the nuclear weapon. Is just a very blunt instrument, potentially with very far-reaching consequences, and potentially leading to an escalation in tensions with the country concerned. People were very reluctant to move in this direction. The other reason is that, to some extent, the EU is like a club, basically. It's based on cooperation, a certain level of trust between the member states, and nobody in this club likes to attack a club member. The verdict so far is it's probably not a good tool. Regarding Poland, it got stuck. There was this ongoing dialogue between the Commission and Poland. Poland took some steps, but they were not enough to alleviate the concerns on the side of the other EU countries and the Commission. But there is no 4/5 majority to move to the next stage. So basically, it is stuck, and now I think there is not much hope that this process can move onward. And regarding Hungary, the situation is, I think, even more complicated, because when the Parliament triggers Article 7, it is the Council that's supposed to respond to it. So it's now for the Austrian presidency, and in a few months for the Romanian presidency, to engage in a dialogue with Hungary and to oversee the implementation procedure of this article. And this is very difficult to do for member states. That is, in the case of Austria, would have to somehow act like a prosecutor towards the neighbors, and for Romania, that itself is under threat of being the target of an Article 7 procedure, it's even more difficult. So I think it's very unlikely that anything sort of productive can come out of it. But of course, the fact that this article has been used is a very powerful political signal. There are quite a number of other instruments. Some are very soft and some are very useless, basically. But there are 2 things that are relevant. The first one is the infringement procedure to go to the European Court of Justice. And now I see the Commission putting more and more emphasis on this methodology, because it's potentially much more effective. The problem so far has been that the Commission only went to the court when very specific provisions of a regulation or a directive was violated. And that didn't really capture structural problems with regard to the rule of law. I think there's now a certain move in the Commission to try to tackle also generic structural issues, and we'll see whether the European Court of Justice will take this up. The other instrument that is now under discussion basically is to introduce a new conditionality for funding from the structural and cohesion funds. This is under discussion. It's hugely controversial. It's not, there will be a lot of reluctance to adopt this, but potentially this is a very important tool because Hungary receives up to 4% of its GDP from EU funding, and to be under threat of losing this funding is of course a huge lever in the hands of the European Union. But there are many open questions regarding this new conditionality, who takes the decisions, what would be the procedure, and there will be a lot of resistance to it. But I think these two tracks, one is more emphasis on the judicial front, going to the European Court of Justice, and on the other hand, trying to introduce a mechanism that links access to EU funding to the rule of law. I think that two of the more promising routes.